I was talking to a friend who was a pastor in the United Church in New Hamburg and now speaks in a variety of churches. He's spoken here before. And he says that everybody should have to preach a sermon on the massacre of the innocents, I'm not sure why. We're not quite going there today. But I want to start a little bit before that. There's been a few pictures of icons on the screen. And I'm wondering if we can get to the first one of that series. Icons are interesting. I don't know how many of you have spent time looking at icons. They appeal to me, and particularly these ones, appeal to me for a couple of different reasons. These are Coptic Orthodox icons, and they're modern Coptic Orthodox icons, and I really like them. And there's a couple of reasons. One of them is that Susan and I lived in Egypt, and that's the home of the Coptic Church, and so we got used to seeing these icons, and they were sort of the first icons that I really encountered. An icon, at least in the Russian Orthodox tradition, and there's a connection between those two churches, is a painting, a picture that you can look at, and you should be able to see through it and see God's presence. In fact, in Russian Orthodox thinking, we are icons of God. People should be able to look at us and see through us and see God. Now, it's actually not just Russian Orthodox, it's actually biblical, because the word for icon and the word for image are the same, and we are created in the image of God. So we are, in fact, icons, where people should be able to see through us and see God at work in the way that we interact with people, the way we connect with people, the words that we use. Icons, though, in the more traditional sense of what an icon is, are reminders of a story. And it's particularly true in a country like Egypt, where the vast majority of people are illiterate. And so they can't go and look up what the story says in the Bible, but the churches there were surrounded in icons. Icons, some of which were depicting Bible scenes, and some of which were depicting important mentors in the faith, sometimes called saints. And just reminding people of what the story is. And what I really liked about the Coptic Orthodox icons is that they're nice and simple. They just have what's necessary to catch the story. So, I've got a number of them. They're actually quite similar in some ways. And I want you to take a look at what's important in this story. So, what can you see? Sorry? Dove, yep. An angel. Holy Family. The poor donkey, yep. Who seems to be standing still. Donkeys do that a fair amount, yeah. One of the things I love about these icons is underneath, at the not quite the very bottom of the screen. Fish, yeah. I think it's wonderful. It's the Nile. It's one way for the people in Egypt to be able to say, not just here's the Holy Family, but specifically there's papyrus plants and there's fish, which is the Nile. This is Egypt. I mean, it's a clear statement. Anyone who catches those symbols, those are very ancient symbols for Egypt. And then in English, it has a scripture across the bottom. Yeah, I think it's interesting too. Just in case you're wondering, I'm staring at another screen here, so if it looks like I'm staring off in space, I'm not. I'm looking at the same picture you are. So you've got the Holy Family. Sometimes there's another woman with them. I can't remember. It's a Egyptian legend, but she's got a name. I can't remember her name right now. But the angel who's guiding them and protecting them. And as I said, I've got a number of the very, very similar. So I wonder if we can take a look at the next one, Laverne. So this one's quite similar. I think it's kind of almost comical with the donkey in the boat, looking a little bit lost. But one of the things I find fascinating here is two things. Is the building in the background, which I'm pretty sure is part of the ruins now in Alexandria. And the boat is a felucca. They still sail on the Nile. And so again, it's by the icon writer. Icons are not painted, they're written. The icon writer is claiming this scene as an Egyptian scene by having those two items in it. I'm not sure that icons are not just paintings. Icons are blessed and are in churches. I have a suspicion that this is not. But what I found fascinating with this one is that you got the same Holy Family in a boat. I'm not sure I'd want to be in that boat, but it's there. And you've got a pharaonic symbol in the bottom, and you've got the pyramids. And part of what I find fascinating in Egypt is how old things are. So those pyramids were over 1,000 years old when Abraham got there. I mean, just contemplate that. I mean, they were just absolutely ancient when Abraham got there, and we think of Abraham as sort of, around at the beginning of creation almost. So, they're, again, claiming this scene, the Holy Family's time in Egypt in a very, and putting it in Egypt. This one is quite similar to the first one. Again, the papyrus plants in the background. Donkey looking a bit more hopeful. This is not a Coptic icon. It follows much more of a Russian style. But what I found fascinating about it is the mother-child connection. I mean, I can remember carrying, especially Macon, on my shoulder. Some of you know who I'm talking about. This is my daughter, who's now in her 20s. But carrying her on my shoulders. But every so often, she would do exactly that to Susan. Reach out and sort of go flying off. And you see that lots of that between parents. So there's just this really human connection depicted in this scene. This is a much older Coptic icon. The style is a bit different. It's not unrelated to those earlier ones, but it feels quite a bit different. But it's also got Arabic writing on it. And I think that's quite interesting because the Coptic Church lives with a strong tension with the Arabic speakers, and everybody who goes to the Coptic Church, even if they learn Coptic, also grew up speaking Arabic. And so it's, again, placing that writing places it in the context of Egypt in a very real way. So, as I said, for me, those icons I enjoy looking at because partly the simplicity, partly because we were there. When we lived in Egypt, we lived in Asyut for the 2 years. Just to the north of Asyut was a monastery called Deir el-Maharig. And that monastery was supposed to be the place where Mary and Joseph and Jesus spent, I think, the longest time. It wasn't a monastery at that point, but in that area they were supposed to have stayed there for the longest time of any of their stays in any place in Egypt. Immediately north of the place where we were staying, like it was our compound, and then there was a road, and then there was a canal. That canal was known as the Wadi Yusuf, Joseph's canal. Joseph of the multicolored dreamcoat, sort of Joseph. And so, whatever you do with these sort of stories, it doesn't matter if you're skeptical or not. These are still reminders. The name, I mean, that was not the name that the Christians gave to everybody. This is the Wadi Yusuf. That's just what it was called. And it was a reminder of the rich history in Egypt and the rich history of connecting them to the Bible stories. Just to the south of Asyut was another monastery called Deir Dronka. And Deir Dronka was, the Nile Valley in places has got quite steep edges, and that was the case around Asyut. And most of the time, you're in the bottom of the valley, and you don't get to see very much. But Deir Dronka was halfway up the escarpment. And so it had this absolutely incredible view across the Nile Valley. And so we would go there at times just to enjoy the view and get ourselves out of some of the crowds and whatnot. And there were reasons that we visited these two monasteries. I went to Dar el-Maharij about once a week to teach English. And we went regularly to Der Dranke for other meetings and stuff. But it was a wonderful spot to be. But that was supposedly, it was a big cave in the side of the escarpment. And it was supposed to be the furthest south that the Holy Family got in their journeys. Now, all of this, none of this is biblical. All of it comes from traditions. I don't know how much weight you put on any of it, but for the Egyptians, the Egyptian Christians, it was really, really significant. So we were surrounded by all of these memories of the Bible and the Bible stories. And so when I look at these icons, partly it connects me with those Bible stories, but partly it connects me with the churches in Egypt. And there's more than one church, but the Coptic Orthodox one is the biggest and the one with the longest history. And it connects me and back to think of some of our brothers and sisters in that church in a place that has not been an easy place to be a Christian for a long, long time. It's much harder now than it was even when we were there. And it's a really, really old church. So Warner is 180 and a bit. Something like that. And Preston, I tried to figure it out last night on the internet, 175, 100 and... Okay, someone better change Gameo because Gameo's wrong. the Mennonite Encyclopedia, because that's where I got. Anyway, so, okay, for this area, these are old churches. I mean, you go and talk to some of the folks in Hespeler, the United Church, they're really proud of how old their church is. I think it's 150 years old. I mean, our churches have been around a long time. When we were in Egypt, I was in churches that have been worshipped in for over 1,700 years. It's mind-boggling. So it connects me in with a... when I look at these icons, it connects me in that sort of way. But it reminds me of the story. And there was one church that a friend of ours went to in Shobra, which is a subdivision of Cairo. It's a subdivision with 3 or 4 million people living in it. And this church had painted, starting at the door... I'm just trying to think of which way around it went. It went the opposite way that we would do it. Anyway, it went all the way around. Pictures of the life of Jesus on the walls. I don't know if they call them icons or if they'd be pictures, but it was absolutely incredible in the style that we were looking at earlier. So, those sort of memories are significant for me as I look at these paintings. The thing is, as you look at those paintings that we had up there, by and large, they look very serene. It's often called the flight to Egypt, but they don't look like they're fleeing. They look more like they're on a journey. I'm sure that, they were also refugees, though, so, the whole situation was not much fun for them. But the story in Palestine did not end with Jesus leaving. It ends it doesn't end, but part of the story is really not nice. Herod is a really nasty guy. He was also he must have been really insecure, because whenever he felt that someone was opposing him, he had them killed. And he saw people opposing him a lot. He had several wives. Several of them got killed because he was afraid that they were trying to usurp his power. He had a number of children killed because he was afraid that they were usurping his power. He had a number of other people killed because he was afraid that they were usurping his power. He tried hard to get rid of any sorts of opposition. So when the wise men showed up and started talking to him about a king being born, this didn't sit well with him. And so he tried to get rid of this king. And when he became aware that he'd been tricked by the wise men, he set out to kill all of the young boys in Bethlehem. Now, I've got another picture here. I think it's a picture, not an icon. I'm sure it's a picture. And it may be hard to see. I've got a close-up in the next shot. But it's a picture of the Massacre of the Innocents. Laverne, let's put on the next one too, please. Just a bit closer up. The look on her face. There were lots of paintings of this story. It's got lots of action and violence, and lots of the pictures, for some reason, don't have enough clothes on it to show the pictures in church. I don't get the style, but anyway. But this one really struck me. This one was painted about 170 years ago. And the pain on her face just really struck me. And it struck me that the pain on her face is reflected in lots of mothers that we see on the news whose children are killed or affected in various war zones around the world. Now, as I look at this picture, I can't explain the events that happened, except to say that it wasn't God who did it. It was Herod. But that's not a totally satisfactory statement, but it's a really ugly part of the Christmas story. Somehow, in the story of Jesus, there almost always seems to be a lot of opposition and a lot of pain and a lot of struggle. Over and over and over again. It's true not just in the story of Jesus, but this is Christmas. We're talking about the beginnings of the story of Jesus. It seems that over and over and over again, there's pain and suffering and opposition in the story. But there's some other things that also come through in the story. One of them is that God has been at work preparing things for Jesus' coming for a long, long time. I think it was last year in the Lessons and Carols. The name was Hinge of History or something like that. Okay, I was close then. Yeah, because maybe it's not just Christmas, maybe it's the life of Jesus on earth is the hinge pin in history, but there is a very real sense in which history is focused on Jesus, was focused for years before Jesus' time, and has been after, of which we're part of that story. But God had been at work for a long time, inspiring people in, say, writing the scriptures. And so that there's a number of prophecies written down a long time before Jesus' time. In fact, some of the prophecies we read about in the Old Testament that are pointing towards Jesus were written down 1,000 years, 1,500 years more before the birth of Jesus. In other words, almost as far before the birth of Jesus as we are after the birth of Jesus. God was at work for a long time, putting together some of these things, getting things ready to point towards Jesus. And part of the story that we read today is Matthew's attempt to make sure that we catch this flow of history and the significance in the flow of history. So, Matthew points this out in a number of different ways. When Matthew writes about the birth, which was before what we read today, he points to a prophecy from Isaiah chapter 7. In today's text, there are 3 prophecies. The first one talks about God calling his son out of Egypt from Hosea. Now, the interesting thing about this particular text is that in Hosea, it's pretty clear that the text is talking, it's a historical reflection of God calling God's people out of Egypt. And yet here, Matthew's using that same text to talk specifically about Jesus. In some respects, Matthew is telling us that Jesus is the fulfillment and the promise of all of Israel. The second one, they talk about the voices of the mothers and the children. It's a prophecy that comes out of Jeremiah 31. And the third one is a prophecy about returning to Nazareth. And there's a number of questions about that as we look at it, but for Matthew, it was a clear statement that came from Isaiah in chapter 11. 3 prophecies, as I said, you just read around the text that we read today a little bit, and you see a number of other prophecies. I think that Matthew's trying to tell us a couple of things. The first one is that God has been at work at this project for a long time. This isn't a last-minute put-together thing. God has been at work with this for a long time. The second one is that I think that we're being told that Matthew's trying to make sure that we get that Jesus is the one. That Jesus is the one that all these prophecies point to. Jesus is the one that at the time of his birth, all sorts of stuff happened that you wouldn't have expected. And yet they happened in a way that fulfilled these prophecies. So not only are the prophecies pointing towards it, but the events of his birth made it fit into these prophecies. And the third thing is, I think, that by saying that God has been at work for a long time, and in saying that Jesus is the one, Matthew is saying to all of us who are readers, pay attention. Pay attention to what's coming up in this story because it's really, really important. In fact, it's world-changing, life-changing. Pay attention. And so he's starting off with these prophecies and the fulfillment of the prophecies. So as we read it, we go, oh, and it catches our attention. We start focusing and we start looking at it more carefully. And he's saying, just keep watching. Keep looking at it as we go through the story, because this stuff is going to be really, really important to you. In fact, it's kind of interesting if you look at the very end of the book of Matthew. We're looking at the beginning, but if you look at the end, Matthew's saying, pay attention, watch this guy. And at the very end of the book, he says, this is the guy who is going to send us out and tell us to make disciples of the nations. This is the guy who's going to command us to baptize people and to teach them to follow the ways of God. Matthew says, this is the guy who it looks like maybe he was almost deserted at his birth, but this is the guy who's going to say to us, I'm with you. I'm with you to the end of time. This is the Jesus that Matthew's writing about. And this is why he's setting it up at the beginning, to make sure that we're paying attention, because this story is such a vital story. It's a story that's going to change our lives as readers and as followers. Matthew's saying, pay attention. And ultimately, Matthew's saying, follow this one. This one that is fulfilling all these prophecies, follow him. Follow Jesus. Let's pray. Lord, sometimes these stories can start feeling old for us, and we can go, and we just carry on. And yet, the stories are so revolutionary. Your Son has come. And that makes a difference in the world. It makes a difference in our lives. help us. Help each one of us as we work at following. Help us as we choose the ways today, tomorrow, this week of responding to your call in our lives. Help us walk with you. In Jesus' name, amen.